Well, ladies and gentlemen, another day in Retardistan, and I know you've logged on to see what retarded news is in the news today. But before we get on to the main news today, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It really does help. So let's get on to the first news article. And that is that Afriforum has produced a dossier on Julius Malema. Now, the actual dossier calls on the international community to take punitive actions against Julius Malema, obviously the leader of the EFF. Now, the accusations inside the dossier include human rights violations, hate speech, corruption, and support for terrorist organizations. Now, the local remedies in South Africa, the MPA, the HRC, and the Constitutional Court are all highlighted as having failed to hold him accountable. Now, Afriforum and the SAAI have requested international sanctions underneath the U.S. Magnitsky Act and have called for diplomatic pressure and public condemnation of Julius Malema. Now, the actual dossier is split into three sections. The first is around the violent rhetoric, the hate speech, and the racist remarks uttered by Julius Malema, which highlights frequent chants of kill the Boer, kill the farmer, which was declared illegal by the Constitutional Court in 2025. Now, it highlights statements suggesting potential slaughter of white people, at least for now, and endorsements of slogans like "the honeymoon is over for white people," "revolution demands killing," and "cutting the throats of whiteness." It highlights threats of violence, such as "we will remove this government through the barrel of a gun," and encouraged illegal land occupation. It also shows social media posts like "maybe, maybe not" in response to farm murder accusations, and personal threats in parliament such as "I'll kill you outside." Now, the second section also highlights the anti-Western statements and support for terror groups. It highlights how the EFF's policy frames the West as imperialist oppressors, how NATO is described as a war alliance and bloodthirsty imperialists, and how the US itself is accused of destroying global progress, imperialism, and as being an enemy of progress. The EU is described by the EFF as having been told to go to hell with their money and called for withdrawal from the Commonwealth and anti-French protests. Australia is highlighted as having been lashed out after proposals to grant visas to white farmers, and alliances and admiration being expressed as China, Russia, Libya, Zimbabwe, Cuba, and Venezuela. With Hamas and Iran having both received support from the EFF with shoot-to-kill resistance chants, and a promise to arm Hamas if the EFF ever takes over. The EFF has also pushed for the closure of the Israeli embassy and the renaming of Santon Drive to, well, one terrorist drive. So as you can see, the EFF are pretty anti-Western, according to this dossier. The final section highlights the corruption allegations, with specific reference given to the On-Point Engineering case, the VBS Mutual scandal. As you know, that was the collapse of a bank that cost South Africa 2 billion rand. And as you will also know, witness statements implicate Malema and the EFF leadership in receiving illicit donations from that entire event, although no one's ever actually been charged. Now, they also highlight tax evasion, racketeering allegations, and obviously the initial funding for the EFF received in 2013 of 650,000 rand, which actually came from an alleged cigarette smuggler, which is a friend of Julius Malema. So underneath the dossier, the actual dossier asks for sanctions against Malema for corruption and human rights abuses to be placed by the international order. They've called for a freeze of Julius Malema's assets and to block financial transactions and issue travel bans. Now, as you'll know, Julius Malema already has a travel ban in place for the United Kingdom. They're also calling to apply diplomatic pressure on South Africa to act where local authorities have failed. But as we've seen following the White House visit, where Julius was also the main attraction, well, Cyril Ramaphosa didn't actually do anything about it. So, with all that being said, and with all of that in mind, I'd love to hear from you. What do you think of the dossier produced by Afriforum, and what do you think of their call on the international community to apply pressure on? So moving swiftly on, if you watched my video on Wednesday, you'll notice that I drew reference to, well, the speech made by Cyril Ramaphosa in Zimbabwe at the agricultural show in Harare, where he basically praised Zimbabwe's land policy, or land reform policy, if you want to call it that, for the speech is actually receiving backlash, noticeably from the Democratic Alliance, who condemned the praise, labeling Zimbabwe's land reform a disaster that collapsed the economy, broke foreign relations, and sparked famine. They warned that such endorsements could scare off investors and exacerbate the economic uncertainty in South Africa. Now, the DA's spokesperson, Willie, stated the remarks were unacceptable, highlighting how Zimbabwe's unlegalized transfers unlegalized, just to be clear, that basically means theft, burdened the state with reparations and warned against adopting similar models underneath the 2025 Expropriation Act. He asserted South Africa's support for constitutional land redistribution, but not at the cost of sound policy. Now, why all of this was really important is because in other news, the Department of Public Works is proposing to invoke the Expropriation Act. Now, let us not forget that the Department of Public Works is run by Dean McPherson, a DA minister. In any case, the idea is to invoke the act to reclaim both state-owned and private buildings that have been hijacked, illegally occupied, and abandoned across the Western Cape. 43 sites in the province have already been flagged under a new initiative called Operation Bring Back, aimed at identifying and retrieving these properties. Now, the Deputy Public Works Minister explained some of these buildings were originally intended for social housing projects, and they're now subsidized or rented out for profit or used for criminal activities. Now, when we say subdivided or rented out for profit, they're not actually done by the government or the original owners. They're rented out and subdivided by the hijackers. Now, many state properties were left vacant when many of these departments relocated without officially reporting or decommissioning the actual building. We've seen numerous examples where basically the government is paying for more than one building. They've got like two of these, but only one's actually occupied. And as a result, they were left unoccupied and then they were illegally occupied. Now, Operation Bring Back is structured around recovery efforts across major metros. In the Western Cape, officials are already evicting current occupants from targeted properties, and the campaign also includes land appropriated improperly or illegally occupied. So I suppose this makes the question of whether you can get all of those, shanty towns, townships, wherever else. Can you kick people off that? Because you could say that was basically unoccupied, and so we should expropriate. Well, I don't know if ownership was ever actually a problem in many of these things, because whilst you can expropriate the property and say the ownership reverts, can you actually kick people out of it? Because I'm pretty sure that's a different law. Anyway, that's not for me to decide, is it? In any case, it's actually important to note that the law that the DA really says they don't like is about to be enacted by a DA minister in the Western Cape, which is DA run. You can let me know what you think of that in the comments section below. Moving then on to the very last news article that I want to cover today, and this is the comments made by Minister Meth. Yep, Minister Meth, who expressed publicly concern over significant job losses unfolding across multiple sectors in South Africa. This is after the news that the ArcelorMittal plant is set to shut down by the end of September, directly leading to around 3,500 jobs and up to an additional 100,000 jobs losses being felt downstream. This is in suppliers and support industries. This is also after the Ford Motor Company planned to cut 474 jobs across their plants in Pretoria and Port Elizabeth, and Goodyear having shut down its operations, having resulted in 900 job losses. According to her, her department could not intervene in that instance because Goodyear did not submit an application for relief. But the problem is that ArcelorMittal were in collaboration with the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition and the Industrial Development Corporation, the IDC, and they tried to mitigate the impact of the closure. But in May 2025, a significant UIF allocation of around 416 million rand, which was supposedly secured under a temporary employer-employee relief scheme supporting 2,982 jobs, collapsed and they didn't actually secure the funding. Now, the UIF agreement required a guarantee that no retrenchments would take place. So this is obviously something that the unions tried to put in place, and they said they couldn't honor that because they would have to restructure the plants in order to make it more profitable. Now, as a result, and as a result of the trade unions' pressure on that, because obviously they always want to, bleed the stone for whatever they can, well, it actually collapsed the plant. And as a result, the plant just said, screw this, we're closing up and we're done. Now, that itself is going to have massive impacts on the country itself due to the downstream pressures that will place on suppliers and support industries. Now, the minister says that she recognizes the broader economic challenges like trade wars and heightened tariffs, and a slowdown in manufacturing, and adding complexity to job preservation efforts. She said the solutions required a coordinated, multi-sectoral approach involving government and private stakeholders. She stressed that job preservation remains the department's primary mandate and assured that efforts to support vulnerable companies and minimize layoffs are ongoing. And to all of this, I say, well, complete bullshit. I mean, I understand that at the moment, South Africa is having a lot of job losses, and all of these are due to ANC policy. We have policies in place now, like BE, that's trying to get rid of white people from the workplace because, ANC is, racist. And the reality is that they hide their racism behind transformation. But the reality is that in itself is having a massive impact on employers in the country. I mean, that's just one thing. What about the security of property rights? What about the anti-Western sentiment? We just talked about it with Julius Malema. What about the fact that Cyril Ramaphosa has all these bright spark policies that he wishes to put in place, but does none of them? They've all been told that you can't put all these additional costs on the consumer for things like NHR. Well, they sign it anyway. We're told by Minister Moron that apparently you're getting it whether you want it or not. I mean, he doesn't know how you're going to afford it or pay for it, but he can do it anyway. And the reality is that there is a large number of jobs being lost in the Republic, and it's all due to ANC policy. What about the fact that the unions have overrepresentation in the Republic and too much power? And the ANC wants it that way because they think that the unions will encourage voters to vote for the ANC. But in many instances, Goodyear is a really good example. Goodyear was collapsed because of demands from unions. We have a KZN police chief that's even saying that the police unions there are strangling the police industry and they can't hire more people because the limited budget they have is all being allocated to the limited number of police officers there are, and so they can't actually grow the police force. There are numerous examples of this, but the ANC have no desire to change that because, well, the unions they feel support them. And so the reality is they have all these lame-brain policies in place that are destroying the country, and the ANC is making zero attempt to change anything because they like the status quo. They like people being unemployed because, let's be honest, the ANC wanted to transform themselves and make themselves very wealthy, and they have. If they bankrupt the rest of the country and everybody else lives in squalor, well, they don't care because they live like princes and kings. So what do they care? They're only really going to care when it impacts them, and then it's a long time for them to be impacted because they got the whole state to loot. In any case, that's just my views. Do let me know what you think in the comment section below. Until next time, bye.